When I make these videos, frequently I get asked about the monitor back here. This is a 49-inch ultra-wide display. And you might say, why are you using that display? It's kind of an odd size or whatever. Well, as I'll mention in this video, these are monitors as well as this. And you may or may not know that the video card is limited to a maximum of 4 displays. It can only output to 4 displays at one time. So the reason I'm using this 49 ultra wide is it gives us a nice wide field of view while only consuming 1 monitor port, because we only have 1 left that we could hook up. So trying to hook up triple display plus these, that would be 5 displays. And then you have to get into using the onboard graphics. So that's why I chose to do the video with the 49 ultra wide. Now this is a 1080p display. It's the equivalent of 2 27-inch 1080p monitors side by side, obviously with no bezel in the middle. This one's made by Samsung. There's also one made by Viotech, which is several $100s cheaper and gets pretty good reviews. So I would probably recommend checking out the Viotech over the Samsung just for that reason. I think maybe you're paying a little bit of a Samsung tax there, but I did want to mention the display because I usually get some questions about that. Hey, Michael with XForcePC. A number of you have been asking me to take a look at the RealsimGear G1000 suite, or just the G1000. You can buy just one of these units, but we chose to buy the G1000 suite, which contains this panel here in the middle, as well as the panels on either side. I think it runs about 2,000, if I'm not mistaken. First of all, like I did in the previous video about the 530, let's talk about what this is. What this is, these are 2 monitors. I think the resolution is 800 by 600. They don't have to be terribly high resolution for, for this display, because you're not doing high-res graphics on here. They also connect to the computer with 2 USB ports each. So this has 2 USBs and this has 2 USBs. So you need a total of 4 USB ports if you have this entire suite. You also need 2 monitor connections. So it might look like we have 1 monitor here, but technically to the computer we have 3 monitors set up here. Obviously we have our monitor up here for our scenery, and then we have the G1000 suite down below. So that's just kind of a quick overview of how this stuff works, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the details. Now, one of the things you'll have to do from time to time on these units is update the firmware. And that on this suite, there are 4 different firmwares. So there's as I mentioned, there are 2 USB ports on this device, and there's 2 USB ports on this device. Each USB port has its own firmware. And it's not a hard process to update, and generally the easiest way to do it is just have one of the units plugged in on one side, and then you're flashing the right one. And you can get the firmware from the RealsimGear website. But pretty much, if you buy one of these systems, that's one of the steps you're going to have to take care of. So that's a little, I don't know, unusual or time-consuming to do 4 firmware updates. But realistically, it only took me about 10 or 15 minutes to accomplish it. Now let's talk about what planes this will work with. In general, as far as I can tell or know, I don't like to make blanket statements, but any plane that uses the X-plane G1000 should work with this device. Again, I don't like to make blanket statements, but as far as I can say, any plane that uses the X-plane G1000 will work just fine. Let's look at an example, though, of one that won't work just fine. That is which one was it? This SR22. So this SR22 uses Coronado's, hopefully I'm pronouncing their name right, that's how I say it. It uses their G1000 unit. And because it uses their G1000, their homegrown G1000, it does not work with the RealsimGear G1000 units. because what the RealsimGear does for its displays is it just takes the display you're seeing in the cockpit and mirrors it down here. But with these GPSs, you can't drag this, as far as I can tell, off the screen. So it's kind of locked onto this screen, and part of the process of setting this up is you actually drag it down here to have your display. So, whoops, I keep bumping into that. So one of the prerequisites for what planes you can use this with is you want to make sure that the plane that you want to simulate uses X-planes built in G1000. I can't really fault Coronado here because I think they wrote their own because X-plane didn't have one. And now that X-plane has one, they should probably switch over to X-planes or give you the option to switch to X-planes so that you can use products like this. But luckily, most of the planes I've tested do use the X-plane G1000 and do work fine. So let's talk about some of the planes that do work well and that I can confirm work with this unit. I'm going to zoom in here. One of the planes that seems to work well, and I'll confess I don't know how to work a G1000. Hopefully Austin's going to come do a video demo and help me out with that. But one of the planes that works well that we're flying now is the Aerobasque Diamond DA62, and from what I can tell, it does work just fine. And this is the plane I am speaking of right here. And one of the things you can do is once you're satisfied, everything's good to go, you can just get rid of the panel there and control everything from this console. As you may or may not be able to see, because my arm's in the way, I am able to change the frequency. The heading bug here is moving. You can, all these buttons work. The DME comes up when I press that button, the transponder. So, all this stuff does function and work well. It does mirror what you see in the cockpit is exactly what you're going to see on here. Now let's take a look at another plane that I have tried, the Aerobasque E1000 G1000 edition. Pull that one up. There we go. And so we're paused right now. So here's that cockpit. And here's what the plane looks like. And then of course you can go to forwards with scenery only, or you can have, if you want to bring up the cockpit for whatever reason, if there's some things you need to see in here, you can do that. And then of course, we have the Cessna Skyhawk G1000. I think that's the last one that I have loaded that is compatible. There we go. And of course, you could make the cockpit go away. And I'll unpause it if that's a thing. And you can see everything's working here. I'm able to change my altitude, fine and coarse, my heading bug, and I know my arm is probably in the way. I can actually do it over here. You can see the heading bug turning there. See the altitude changing, coarse and fine. My nav frequency changing right over here. And so that's the Cessna 172 G1000 that comes with X-plane. And again, from what I can tell, any plane that uses the X-plane G1000 should work just fine. Now, the next thing, if you want to hang on, I'm going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how this works specifically. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, these units are like monitors. And so if I go to the Windows display settings, you'll see here that we have the one really wide display up here. It's a 49-inch super ultra wide. And then we have the two displays down here which represent our RealsimGear units. If I hit identify, you'll see numbers show up on the screens, so you can verify that. And depending on how you have these arranged, you can drag these boxes around, wherever you might have them. But of course, we have them right in the center and right next to each other. And the good thing about having them pushed up right next to each other is that my mouse can actually go back and forth across them this way if I need it to for some reason. So one of the first things you do is you get your monitors arranged correctly. Another thing you have to do is on these little displays, for whatever reason, they put the monitors in upside down. And I'm sure there's a really good reason for that. I don't know what it is, but you have to change the orientation to landscape flipped, which essentially flips the screen over, so it's not upside down. And you do that on both displays. And this is all detailed in the RealsimGear documentation. Now the other thing you do is, I mentioned earlier, is you have to update the firmware, and then you also have to copy into your X-Plane folder the RealsimGear. So you go to your Resources Plugins folder, the RealsimGear plugin right here. It's just a folder. It comes in a zip file. You extract that zip file, and then you can just drop it into your Resources Plugins folder, and that makes these units work with X-Plane. All right, and then once you have your screen set up correctly, one other thing you have to make sure is you want this monitor up here to be your main display, and that's right down here, this little checkbox, because the main display is the one that X-Plane is going to open up on. So when we fire up X-Plane, X-Plane is going to see 3 displays. And I'm just going to pick a new flight in the Cessna Skyhawk. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it basically mirrors what's on the GPS in X-Plane. And the way you accomplish that is you simply pop out the X-Plane GPS like this, and put it into a window, drag it down here, and then maximize it. And you do the same thing over here with this one. Pop it into a window, drag it over here. I can get it over here right, and then maximize it. And then you can take X-Plane, hit Control W, and you're all set to go. So it's a kind of a simple process from that regard. It's simply mirroring exactly what you would see in the X-Plane cockpit on these displays. And then all of these buttons, of course, are functional, and the plug-in is what handles what all these buttons do. The plug-in is responsible for that. These are sort of 2-in-1 units. You've got a monitor in here, and then you've got these are almost like joystick buttons in a way. And that allows it to control the GPS in X-Plane. One thing I did fail to mention is there's some artwork files that you download to get rid of the bezels. And you might be like, well, what do you mean get rid of the bezels? What are you talking about? See, normally the G1000, when it comes up, it looks like this. It's got all this stuff around the edges. Well, you don't need that because you have physical buttons for that. So you just download a little artwork file from the RealsimGear website. It's in the documentation, and you replace the X-Plane artwork so that you don't have all these buttons showing up on the screen around the edges. Hopefully that makes sense. A couple of other little things I'll mention. The viewing angles are not great on these displays. So what I mean by that is as you view them at an off angle, they'll sort of look dimmer. But basically you just want to make sure that these are aimed directly at your face. If you need to tilt them up a little bit or down a little bit to prevent that shift in brightness from occurring. Obviously, they're not IPS displays. If they were, you wouldn't see that color shift. Otherwise, they're perfectly serviceable displays. They do exactly what you need them to do. So there's an overview, my take on the RealsimGear G1000 suite. I do hope to have Austin come in here and sit down, because I believe his plane, if I'm not mistaken, has this same setup, and have him do sort of a deeper dive on how to use it, how it functions. I'm not a pilot and I don't know how to work a G1000, so I'm limited into what I can show you from a functionality standpoint. I can show you from the technical aspect, and then we'll have Austin show you from the functionality aspect. Look for that video probably next week.